The morning the will was read, Clara Whitmore stood at the window of the long gallery at Ashbourne, and the whole room decided what she was before she had spoken a word. She wore grey, the same grey she had worn to the old Earl's funeral 3 days before, because a ward without fortune owned nothing better, and against the gilt and the winter light, the color made her look like a smudge someone had left on the glass. The solicitor cleared his throat. The dowager arranged her skirts. And in the doorway, still travel-stained from the road, the new Earl of Ashbourne looked at her once, a long, steady look she could not read, and then looked away as though he had settled some private question and found the answer plain. She had lived in that house for 11 years. She had been 8 when the old Earl brought her home, a distant connection, orphaned by a fever that took a village, and he had raised her at his own table with a gentleness the county thought eccentric. Now he was in the ground beneath the chapel floor, and the men in the room were speaking of her as one speaks of an inconvenience that must be managed before the real business can begin. What none of them yet knew, and what she did not know either, was that a single sheet of paper folded in the solicitor's case would within the hour name her a thief. Stay with me. What happened in that gallery was not the end of Clara. It was the moment before the beginning. The solicitor was a careful man named Mr. Pruitt, and he read the old Earl's true will in a dry, even voice, and it was a generous document. To Clara, ward of the house, the late Earl had left the dower cottage at Meldon, and an income of £400 a year that she might never again be dependent on any man's charity. It was more than a ward could expect. It was. Clara understood as the words fell, the last kindness of the only father she could remember, reaching for her from beyond the chapel floor. She had time to feel it, that warmth, for perhaps the length of a breath. Then the dowager spoke. Lady Rosalind Ashbourne, aunt to the new Earl, sat very straight in her black bombazine with jet at her throat, and she said, in the tone of a woman correcting a servant's error, that there was another paper. A later paper, one that had come to her hand only that week, and that she had felt bound in conscience to place before Mr. Pruitt. The second sheet passed from her gloved fingers to the solicitor's, and Clara watched his face change as he read it. The color left his cheeks and did not return. When he looked up, he did not look at the Earl. He looked at her. The paper was a will also, or claimed to be, dated a fortnight before the old Earl's death. In it, the dower cottage and the £400 were struck out. In their place, the ward Clara was named residuary legatee of the entire unentailed estate, the very heart of Ashbourne's wealth, some £40,000, and the land at Meldon and the house at Bath, all of it to pass to a girl of 19 with no name and no fortune of her own. And it was written, every line of it, in Clara's own hand. She knew her own writing. She would have known it in the dark. The loops of the letters, the particular slant, the way she crossed her sevens in the French manner the old Earl had taught her at a schoolroom desk long ago, it was her hand on that page, as surely as her face was her face. And she had never seen the paper before in her life. You see, the dowager said, to the room, to the Earl, to the God she doubtless believed, watched approvingly over the order of things. What she is. The word she used was not spoken then. It came later, and it came often. Yet the room heard it, in the silence just the same. Impostor, the provincial nobody, the old man had petted, revealed at last as a schemer who had forged a dying man's name to steal what was never hers. Clara did not faint. She did not weep. She stood at the glass in her funeral grey and felt the floor of 11 years drop away beneath her. And she said, in a voice that came out steadier than she had any right to expect, that she had never written that will, and that she would swear it on the old Earl's grave. Naturally you would swear it, the dowager said, and turned her face away as though the sight of Clara had become distasteful. The Earl said nothing at all. He stood by the door with his glove still in his hand, and his face was still as ice over a river. And Clara understood with a cold, plummeting certainty that he believed it. Of course he believed it. He had come home to bury a father and inherit a burden, And here was the burden with a stolen fortune in her hand and her guilt written in her own ink. What was she to him but a stranger who had tried to rob his house? She was escorted from the gallery by a footman who would not meet her eyes. To understand what that morning cost her, you must understand what she had been before it. Clara had come to Ashbourne a silent, frightened child, and the old Earl, whose own wife was long dead and whose son was away at his regiment, had made a project of her happiness with the quiet stubbornness of a lonely man. He taught her Latin because she asked to learn it. He let her ride the old grey mare across the Meldon fields until she rode better than his grooms. He kept her at his side through the long evenings when the great house emptied of guests, and he read to her from his prayer book. And when he found her weeping once for a mother she could barely remember, he pressed into her hand a small pressed cornflower he kept between the pages, and told her that grief and love were the same water in different weather, and that she must never be ashamed of either. She had kept the cornflower. It was among the few things she owned that were truly hers, and it lived still between the pages of the prayer book the old Earl had given her on her 15th birthday, and it was the one thing she took from her room at Ashbourne when they told her she must go. For she was to go. The Dowager was clear on that point. A charge of forgery was a hanging matter, and Lady Rosalind, out of what she called Christian forbearance and the honor of the family, would not prosecute. Even so, Clara could not remain under the roof she had tried to steal. She would be given until the end of the week to remove herself, and she would go without character, without reference, without the income the true will had promised her, because the true will was now in dispute, and the false one had poisoned everything. The Dowager had a companion in her satisfaction, and his name was Marcus Ashbourne. He was the old Earl's nephew, cousin to the new Earl, a smooth, handsome man of 30, with a tailor's eye and a gambler's debts, and he had spent the years of the old Earl's decline hovering at the edges of Ashbourne like a man reading a house he expected to inherit. It was Marcus who, in the drawing-room that evening, said the word aloud for the first time where Clara could hear it. "The little forger," he said, warming his hands at the fire, not troubling to lower his voice as she passed the open door. "One almost admires the nerve to copy the old man's affection and think it made her one of us." He said it to amuse the Dowager, and the Dowager smiled. Clara went on down the corridor with the prayer book pressed against her ribs, and did not let them see her falter. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the window of the small room that had been hers since childhood, and she turned the thing over and over, and the more she turned it, the less sense it made. She had not written the will. Someone had. Someone who knew her hand well enough to counterfeit even the French sevens. Someone who wanted Ashbourne's unentailed fortune, and who had understood that the surest way to seize it was not to claim it outright, but to make the ward appear to have claimed it, and then to destroy her with the very paper that named her. Who profited, though, by making her the thief? Not she, who lost everything. Not the Earl, who would have the estate, regardless, once the forgery was set aside. The Dowager profited nothing. Directly she had her own jointure and wanted only the order of the house preserved. There was Marcus, though, Marcus with his debts, who had been named nowhere in the true will and stood to inherit nothing. If the true will could be discredited as one of two contested papers, if the whole question of the old Earl's final intentions could be dragged into chancery and left to rot there for years, then the unentailed estate would fall into abeyance, and a clever cousin with a lawyer and a claim of blood might swim in those muddy waters a long while and come out rich. She could not prove it. She was a girl of 19, with a hanging charge over her head, and until Saturday, to leave the only home she had. Still she knew, the way the body knows a thing before the mind consents to it, that Marcus had forged that will, and that he had done it in her hand, precisely because a ruined ward makes so convenient a thief. The next morning, she did the only thing left to her. She went to find the Earl. He was in the library, the great two-story room where the old Earl had taught her the names of the constellations, from a globe now gone dusty, and he stood at the tall window with his back to the door, and the gray morning light on his shoulders. He had been Earl for 4 days. He wore his grief the way he wore everything, with a rigid economy that gave nothing away, and when he heard her step and turned, his face closed like a door. "You should not be here," he said. His voice was low and level. "It is not proper, and it does you no credit." "I have very little credit left to lose, my lord," Clara said. "I have come to tell you that I did not write that will, and to ask you to look at me while I say it." He looked at her. She would give him that, always, afterward. That he did not refuse to look. His eyes were the color of smoke, and there was something behind them she could not name. Some banked and guarded thing, and for a moment she thought he might speak. Then the door behind her opened, and the dowager came in on Marcus's arm. And whatever might have been said was not. "Edmund," the dowager said, "you cannot be alone with her. Consider what is owed to your father's name." "I am aware of what is owed to my father's name," the earl said, and the flatness of it might have meant anything. Clara left the library with nothing. As she passed Marcus in the doorway, though, she saw him watching the earl and not her, and she saw the small calculation move behind his handsome face, and she understood that he was not yet certain he had won. He was watching to see whether the earl believed, and that told her the earl's belief was the axis on which everything turned. She went to Mr. Pruitt. The solicitor received her in the estate office with the reluctance of a decent man caught between duty and pity. He would not, he said, discuss the matter with her. It was in the earl's hands and the dowager's, and might yet be in the courts. Clara had not come to argue, however. She had come to look at the paper. "You have seen it," Pruitt said. "You saw it read." "I saw it at 10 paces across a gallery," Clara said. "I should like to see it in my hands. In the light, you are an honest man, Mr. Pruitt. If I am the forger, you all believe me. What harm can there be in letting the guilty study her own crime? It was a gamble, and it turned on the one quality she had marked in him, that he did not like what was being done." He hesitated a long moment. Then he laid the false will on the desk before her and stood back. And Clara bent over it in the window light and looked at the thing that had destroyed her. It was very good. Whoever had done it had studied her hand with care. Even so, she knew her own writing as a mother knows her child's cry. And looking now, close, in the full gray light, she began to see the small wrongnesses. The ink was too even. She blotted always. She had never in her life written a clean page. The paper was laid with a watermark she did not recognize, not the Ashbourne stock the old earl used. And at the foot, where her name was signed, the forger had made his single fatal error. He had written the day of the month as the 14th. Clara, though, had been at Bath the whole of that fortnight, nursing the old earl's sister through a fever, a fact a dozen servants could swear to. And she could no more have signed a will at Ashbourne on the 14th than she could have signed it on the moon. She said none of this to Pruitt. She thanked him, and she asked him one question only, gently, as though it hardly mattered. Where, she asked, had the paper come from? Who had first brought it to the dowager's hand? Pruitt did not want to answer. He was an honest man, though, and the question was fair. And after a moment, he told her, the will had been found. So the dowager said among the old earl's private papers in the muniment room, discovered by the person who had been set to sort them after the death. And the person set to sort them, Pruitt said, had been the earl's cousin, Mr. Marcus. Clara thanked him again, and went out into the cold, and for the first time since the gallery she felt something in her chest that was not despair. It was small and hard and steady. It was the beginning of a way through. You are ahead of her now, perhaps. You have seen the shape of it. Clara, though, had 3 days and no friend in the world, and a hanging charge, and a man she needed to convince who had every reason not to listen. Hold that in your mind as she walks back across the frozen park, because what she does next, she does entirely alone. The witnessing scene when it came, she did not stage and did not know was witnessed. There was a child at Ashbourne. His name was Tom, and he was the gardener's boy, 7 years old and small for it, with a cowlick that would not lie down, and a stammer that the servants' hall found tiresome and the dowager found intolerable. Clara had spent her ruined afternoon in the still room because she did not know where else to be. It was a low, warm room that smelled of dried lavender and beeswax and the metal tang of the copper pans, and she had been grinding rosemary in a mortar simply to have something in her hands, when Tom had crept in out of the cold to steal a moment by the small fire. He had a chilblain on one thumb and no coat worth the name, and he had thought the room empty. He was not there a minute before Mrs. Doyle, the upper housemaid who had scarcely spoken to Clara since the gallery, came sweeping in after him with a face like a closed fist. She caught the boy by the collar and called him a filthy little idler, and her hand went up, flat and quick, the practiced gesture of a woman who had struck children before and expected no consequence. Clara had stepped between them without thinking, the mortar still in her hand. She had put the boy behind her skirts and told the housemaid, in the old Earl's own voice of quiet command, that she had learned at his table across 1,000 evenings that no one under this roof struck a child while she stood in the room, ward or forger or whatever they had decided she was. Mrs. Doyle had stared astonished. That a girl already condemned should dare to command anyone, and something in Clara's steadiness had made her lower her hand and go. And then Clara had knelt on the cold stone in her funeral gray level with the trembling boy and helped him find the words he was reaching for, slowly, without hurry, giving him the whole of her attention and none of her haste, the way the old Earl had once waited through her own frightened silences until they broke of themselves. "There is no need to run the word," she told him gently. "It will come. Take the breath first, and let it come after." And she had waited, and it had come, and the boy had smiled at her with a gratitude so bare it was almost hard to look at. She did not know the Earl had come to the still-room door for a jar of the tincture his father had used for the headaches that ran in the family. She did not know he stood in the passage and watched her kneel in her funeral gray and gentle, a stammering child, who could do nothing for her, who could not clear her name, or restore her fortune, or give her back a single hour of the life she had lost. She did not see his face while he watched. Something in the house shifted after that afternoon. All the same, some pressure eased by a fraction, and though she could not have said why, she felt it. That evening a tray was sent up to her room with a proper supper on it, hot, and a note in a hand she did not know which, said only, "Eat. You will need your strength." It was not signed. The tincture jar in the still room had been moved, though, and she was not a fool. She learned his wound by accident, 3 nights before she was to go. She could not sleep, and the great house at that hour belonged to the sleepless, and she went down to the library because it was the room where she had been happiest, and she wanted to be happy in it one last time. The fire had burned low, and the Earl was there before her. In a chair by the embers, and on the small table at his elbow lay a miniature turned face up in the firelight. A young woman with fair hair and a laughing mouth, and beside it a letter, worn soft with handling. He did not send her away. Perhaps he was too tired, or too far into the country of his own grief to guard the border of it. He told her in short, flat sentences that cost him visibly, that the woman in the miniature had been his wife, that she had died 2 years before, in childbed, and the child with her, while he was 3 counties distant with his regiment, and had come too late even for the burial. That he had learned, standing at her grave, that she had written to him a fortnight before, begging him to come home, and that the letter had followed him from posting to posting, and reached him only after she was cold. He had not opened it in time. He carried it still. He had spent 2 years believing that a man who does not come when he is called has forfeited the right to be trusted with anyone's life. "So, you see," he said, and the smoke-colored eyes met hers across the dying fire. "I am not a man who saves people, Miss Whitmore. I came too late once. I have made it a policy never to be so foolish again as to think I might arrive in time." Clara understood then what she had taken for coldness. It was not that he did not feel. It was that he had decided, in the worst hour of his life, that his feeling was a danger to those it touched, and he had built the ice over the river not to keep the world out, but to keep himself from reaching for what he might fail to hold. "The old Earl believed differently," she said softly. He told me once that grief and love are the same water in different weather. He did not think a man was ruined for arriving late, only for refusing, afterward, ever to arrive at all. The Earl looked at her for a long time. The fire ticked. Somewhere in the house, a clock told the hour. And he said, at last, in a voice she had not heard from him before, that his father had been a better man than he would ever be, and that his father had loved her, and that he did not know what to do with the fact that his father's judgment, which he had trusted in all things, sat so ill against the paper written in her hand. Then trust his judgment, Clara said, and doubt the paper. The paper says I signed a will at Ashbourne on the 14th of last month. I was at Bath that whole fortnight, my lord, in your great-aunt's sick-room, and the household there can swear to every day of it. A woman cannot be in 2 counties at once. Doubt the paper. It is the paper that lies. She saw it land. She saw the exact moment the thing she had said reached him, and began its slow work. He did not answer, though, because to answer was to commit, and a man who has taught himself never to arrive in time does not learn in a single night to run toward the thing he wants. He rose. He said she should not be in the library at such an hour. And he went out and left her by the fire with the miniature of his dead wife watching her from the little table. And Clara sat a long while and did not know whether she had won anything at all. She had 2 days. She spent the first of them writing letters, though she had no money for the post and had to beg the loan of it from the one housemaid who still spoke to her kindly. She wrote to the household at Bath. She wrote to the apothecary there who had made up the great-aunt's physic and dated his bills. She wrote to the vicar of the Bath parish, who had called on the sick-room and would remember the ward who read the psalms aloud. She wrote asking each of them plainly to set down where Clara had been for the whole of the fortnight in question, and to send it under seal to Mr. Pruitt with all the speed they could manage. It was her whole defense. That one fact, that she had not been there to sign. She had no way to prove Marcus had forged the will. She could prove the will was false, though, and a false will proves a forger somewhere. And a forger who had been alone in the muniment room with the old Earl's papers did not need much more pointing at. She did not know if the letters would come in time. Chancery moved in years. The Dowager's mercy expired on Saturday. She sealed her defense and gave it to the post and prayed. And there was nothing then to do. But wait and waiting, she had learned, was the hardest courage of all. On the last evening but one, the Dowager gave a dinner. It was, Clara understood, a deliberate cruelty, though the Dowager would have called it the resumption of proper family life. The county was invited, the near neighbors who mattered, and a girl of the correct sort was set at the Earl's right hand, a Miss Penelope Vane, honey-haired and cool and richly dowered, whom Lady Rosalind had marked as the proper new Countess of Ashbourne almost before the old Earl was cold. Clara was not invited to dine, neither was she permitted to hide. The Dowager sent word that Miss Whitmore would present herself in the drawing-room after dinner, that the family might demonstrate to the county its Christian tolerance of the viper it had nursed, and its firmness in casting her out. It was to be Clara's public sentencing, dressed as courtesy. She came down in her grey, she had nothing else. The drawing-room was lit, as she had never seen it since the old Earl's health began to fail. Every candle in the great chandeliers burning, the long mirrors doubling the light until the room seemed to hold twice as many people as it did, silk and satin, and the cold fire of jewels at 100 throats. Against all of it, she was a grave figure at the threshold, and she felt the whole bright weight of the assembly turn toward her, the way a field of grass turns before a wind. She stood at the edge of the room while the county looked at her over its fans, the small movements of heads leaning to murmur behind gloved hands, the practiced county art of examining a disgrace while pretending to admire the pictures. Miss Vane sat at the Earl's right in ice-blue silk, her fair head bent to some remark of the Dowager's, and she did not trouble to look at Clara at all, which was its own kind of verdict. And Marcus, warm with wine and certainty, stood by the fire with a glass in his hand. And he told the story of the forged will as an amusing thing, a tale to make the ladies gasp behind their fans, sketching the ward's audacity, The copied hand the old man's foolish fondness so cruelly abused. He called her the little forger a second time aloud, in the middle of the crowded room, and this time 36 people heard it and murmured and looked, and a young lady near the pianoforte gave a small delighted shudder, as at a ghost story told well. Miss Vane laughed. The dowager inclined her head as one whose judgment has been publicly confirmed. And Clara stood in the gray at the edge of the light, and felt the whole weight of the season's verdict settle on her, and understood that this was the arena, this bright, cruel room, and that if she was ever to be cleared it would have to be here, where she had been condemned. Not tonight, though. Tonight, the letters had not come. Tonight she had nothing but a fact. No one would let her speak, and she stood and bore it. And when the dowager dismissed her with a flick of the fan, she went, and the drawing-room closed behind her like water over a stone. The Earl had watched the whole of it from beside the mantel, and said nothing. And that silence was the darkest hour of all, darker than the gallery. Because in the gallery he had been a stranger, and now he was not. And his silence in that room while Marcus named her thief was a wound she had not known she was still open enough to take. She went up to her room, and she took out the prayer book and the pressed corn flour, and she thought that perhaps the old Earl had been wrong. Perhaps grief and love were not the same water. Perhaps love was only the thing that taught you exactly where you could be hurt. She did not weep even then. She had gone past weeping. She sat in the cold and held the flour and waited for Saturday. The letters came on Saturday morning. They came all together, 4 of them, carried up the Ashbourne Drive by a postboy on a steaming horse, and they were addressed to Mr. Pruitt. And Mr. Pruitt, God keep him, was an honest man. He read them at his desk in the estate office, and then he sat very still for a while, and then he did a thing that took more courage than a solicitor is usually called on to find. He carried them not to the dowager who had employed him, but to the Earl. Clara knew none of this. She was in her room, folding the last of her small possessions into a bundle, believing the hour of her going had come. She had said her goodbyes, to the gray mare, and to the boy Tom, and to the one kind housemaid. She was fastening the strap on her bundle when the summons came, delivered by a footman whose manner had changed so completely from 3 days before that she scarcely knew him. The Earl requested Miss Whitmore's presence in the drawing-room. At once, and the county, sir, the footman added, was still there. The dowager had kept a party through the night and into the morning, cards and music, and they were all of them still assembled in the bright room where Clara had been named a thief. She understood walking down that she was being called to the arena a second time. She did not know why. She did not know whether it was to be sentence or reprieve. She only knew that whatever was to happen would happen in front of the whole county, in the exact room where the whole county had condemned her, and she straightened her gray and lifted her chin and went in to meet it. The room fell quiet as she entered. The Earl stood at the center of it, and Mr. Pruitt beside him with the 4 letters in his hand, and the dowager rose from her chair with the first uncertainty Clara had ever seen in her, and Marcus by the fire had gone very still. The Earl did not make a speech. He had learned perhaps from a father who valued economy, or perhaps he simply did not have it in him. He held out his hand, and Pruitt gave him the topmost letter, and the Earl read aloud in his low, level voice the sworn statement of the vicar of the Bath parish that Miss Clara Whitmore had attended the sickbed of the dowager's own sister-in-law without a single day's absence through the whole of the fortnight ending the 20th, and had read the evening psalms in his hearing on the 14th itself, 40 miles from Ashbourne, on the very day the false will claimed she had signed her name in the muniment room. He let the paper fall to the table. He looked at the room, and the room looked back, and the silence stretched until it rang. Then he crossed the room to where Clara stood at its edge, crossed it in front of the county and the dowager, and the honey-haired girl at the place of honor, and he stopped before her, and he took her cold hand in both of his, and he said the thing he had come to say. She is no forger. She is under my protection, and she will be my wife. 9 words. He said them once, and did not say them again, and did not need to. The room did not breathe. Miss Vane's fan stopped in the air, and the Dowager, who had ruled Ashbourne for 30 years by the certainty of her own rightness, opened her mouth and found nothing in it, and put her hand to the back of a chair and sat. Marcus moved first. He was a gambler, and a gambler knows the moment the table turns, and he began to say something smooth about a misunderstanding, a paper found in good faith, a mistake any man might make. The Earl did not look at him. The Earl said, still holding Clara's hand, that the false will had been found by one man alone in the muniment room, on a watermarked paper, never used in this house, dated to a day. The true author was proved 40 miles distant, and that Mr. Pruitt would be laying the whole matter before the magistrate on Monday, and that any gentleman who wished to explain his part in it had, until then, to consider his answer. Marcus Ashbourne did not stay for Monday. He was gone from the house before the noon, and gone from the county within the week, and the debts he left behind him told the rest of the story to anyone who cared to read it, which the county, having so recently been wrong, was suddenly very eager to do. The Dowager did not flee. Whatever else she was not a coward. And she sat in her chair while the room rearranged itself around the ruin of her certainty. And after a time she looked at Clara, truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time in 11 years. She did not apologize. Women of her order did not apologize. It was not in the grammar of their lives. She inclined her head, though a small, stiff motion, the same motion with which she had confirmed Clara's guilt 3 nights before, and this time it meant its opposite, and everyone in the room understood the correction, and it was enough. It had to be enough. The Earl had said the family name should not be dragged further through the courts than the removal of Marcus required, and Clara, who knew what it was to be shown mercy one had not earned, and to be denied it when one had, did not ask for more than the bowed head. She let the old woman keep her dignity. It cost Clara nothing, and it was, she thought, what the old Earl would have wished. The county recognized her all at once, the way a crowd does, discovering it had always known her worth. Miss Vane's mother remembered a kindness Clara had done her years before. The near neighbors recalled the ward's gentleness, her Latin, her seat on the grey mare. The room that had condemned her at 9 o'clock was, by noon, prepared to swear it had never doubted her, and Clara received this the way one receives weather, without bitterness and without belief, because she had learned exactly what the county's certainty was worth. That is the public reckoning, and the public reckoning was never the thing she wanted. What she wanted came after, and came quietly, and I will tell you of it, and then let you go. They were married in the spring, in the chapel where the old Earl lay beneath the floor, and it was a small wedding, by the standard of earls, the county rather disappointed of its spectacle. Clara wore not grey. She wore a gown the color of cornflowers, and no one but the Earl knew why, and when he saw her come up the aisle in it, something moved in his still face that the county had never once been permitted to see. The dower cottage at Meldon stood empty. She had no need of it now. She did not let it fall to ruin, though she had it made ready, and she gave it, with its £400 a year, to a use the old Earl would have blessed. The gardener's boy Tom was sent to school at the Earl's charge, and the kind housemaid was made housekeeper, and Clara found that the fortune the old Earl had left her restored to her in full, once the false will was burned in the library grate, was best spent making certain that no other frightened child under that roof should ever again be told they were nothing. On a winter evening, a year after the will was read, Clara sat with her husband in the library, where he had once told her he was not a man who saved people. Snow was falling past the tall windows. The fire was high. He had his father's prayer book open on his knee, the same book, for it had come to Clara with the rest of the old Earl's small things, and between its pages, where it had always lived, lay the pressed cornflower, thin and blue and 11 years old. Edmund lifted it out with great care, as a man handles something that might turn to dust, and he held it to the firelight, and he asked her what it was. She told him. She told him about the frightened child and the lonely old man, and the weeping in the schoolroom, and the flower pressed into her small hand, and the thing the old earl had said about grief and love being one water in different weather, and her husband, who had come too late to one grave and had sworn never to reach for anything again, took her hand and the flower both, and held them in the firelight, and said that his father had been right, and that he was glad in the end that he had not arrived too late for her. Outside, the snow came down and covered the park and the chapel and the muniment room and the whole cold apparatus of the world's judgment, and inside, the fire burned and the cornflower lay blue against the old man's page, and Clara, who had been called a thief in that very house and had answered with nothing but the truth and the patience to wait for it, was at last exactly where she had always, quietly, without ever once demanding it, deserved to be. She was home. If Clara's journey stayed with you, stay a moment more before you go. And think of the flower pressed in the book, and how long a small, true thing can wait in the dark for its weather to come round again. Thank you for staying to the end.